Welcome. We are very happy to be here in this venue. And we would like to thank SCA for inviting us to do this, and Elaine for being our technological support, and Interpreter 1 and Interpreter 2 for kindly interpreting for us. The name of this roundtable is Caring for the Dead in Troubling Times. It addresses the issue of handling the dead in times made precarious for a number of reasons. Drawing on their research in Singapore, Australia, the US, and Japan, the presenters consider practices that have come into existence in a range of circumstances. Hart Island in New York, communal barriers in Japan, usage of Zoom for a funeral of a detainee in jail, overcrowding of cemeteries in Singapore, the crafting of grave friends for socially solo Japanese. We spend most time considering what lessons or insights might we learn from this that are relevant to the present moment of the virus. And each of us will introduce ourselves. We start with Ruth Tolson.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. And thank you to Anne and Hannah for gathering us together for this panel. My self-introduction. My name is Ruth Tolson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with long blonde hair, black framed glasses, and I'm wearing a navy blue sweater. I have an English accent. To begin, some thoughts on the treatment of the dead body in a pandemic. At the very beginning of the epidemic, back in March, when none of us imagined quite how serious this would all be, a friend, also an anthropologist working on death, sent me a link to an article from the New York Times. The headline read, "Italy's coronavirus victims face death alone with funerals postponed. As morgues are inundated, coffins pile up and mourners grieve in isolation." And then a quotation, "This is the bitterest part." This is from March 16th, 2020. Grief, of course, is a peculiar thing. Thinking back to that, this is the bitterest part. It's something it is impossible to feel that one is ever doing properly. But grieving is all the more difficult when it's facilitating frameworks, perhaps the corpse, perhaps the service, religious or otherwise, perhaps a circle of others who can share in grief are absent or forbidden. For me, the article and its photographs of bodies stacked waiting in caskets brought back memories from a period long time ago now. It was when I worked as an embalmer in a mortuary in a Singaporean funeral parlor in the very first year of my PhD fieldwork. It was 2003, and we were in the middle of the SARS crisis. What were those memories? Well, there were memories of quite how sickening it felt to slide bodies into the cremator, having never opened the body bags in which they'd arrived from the hospital. Memories of not having touched these bodies or washed them, not really having acknowledged them. And the fact that the infectious disease grade body bags were really just thick garbage bags, albeit with zippers. And above all, the awfulness of telling families that they couldn't see or touch the body. What might reflections on this period on working as a mortician during a time of SARS illuminate as we consider care for the dead and its transformation during COVID? There's so much to say, but I want to focus on one particular thing. And I suppose we could label that the arbitrariness of it all. When in Singapore in 2003, SARS bodies first began to enter the mortuary, our instructions were not to touch them, not to open the body bags in which they were stored. But morticians knew, and they know now, that such policies were unnecessary. Morticians work using what they refer to as universal precautions, strict protocols to prevent transmission of disease. Whether from the corpse or from those who came into contact with it. The first rule one learns on the very first day of mortuary school is to treat everybody, everybody as if it had AIDS, as if it had tuberculosis, as if it had hepatitis. The SARS corpse presented the embalmer with no issues at all. It could easily be made safe, easily made viewable, easily made touchable. Why then was even opening the body bag forbidden? Month 2 of the crisis, state guidelines from the Singaporean government changed again. Now the rule was that the SARS corpse should be treated as if it were an AIDS corpse. So embalmed again under universal precautions. And then, and this was a new and peculiar addition, the blood that was drained from it channeled not into the sewage system, but into labeled buckets to be collected and incinerated, treated as medical waste. Again, the shift didn't make much sense. The sewage system deals with blood of all sorts every single day. And SARS, like COVID, as far as we know, was not blood-borne. And the body could still not be seen or touched by next of kin. How to read this? Well, I suppose you could read it as the struggle of developing policy in the middle of a crisis. Perhaps, yes. And please do not read what I'm saying as a rejection of guidance concerning funeral rites during an epidemic. For much recent policy on limiting the number to attend a funeral, on social distancing during funerals is obviously good sense. So my question is, if policy to deal with an epidemic is at some level always about something else, what then is the something else? In Singapore, during SARS, the something else was further complicated. To be brief, SARS, a disease that Singaporeans understood as coming from rural mainland China, was about a type of Chineseness that was everything that they stood against. They imagined themselves as having Singaporean Chinese identity, very different from the identity of the poultry farmer from Guangdong province, mainland China, with whom SARS began. The Singaporean accounting of how SARS arrived there, an accounting that is entirely untrue, is that SARS came to Singapore because certain Singaporeans, those with misguided loyalties to both mainland China and to their dead, had traveled back to mainland China to ancestral villages in Guangdong province in order to sweep their ancestral graves. And this focus on blood, concerns over HIV, AIDS, and more particularly over what people described as un-Singaporean immorality. Those had begun in the late 1980s and never gone away. And they thread back into older stories, much older stories, about theories of disease and sources of contagion. So the question that I leave the panel and those who've joined us in the chat room, if a response to an epidemic, in this case, these transformations in how we mark death and how we grieve, are simultaneously about something else. What is COVID's something else? What is the social work that new policies, new rights, new legislation does when it's clear that its purpose is not only, and in some cases, not at all, to keep the living safe? Thank you.
Hannah?
Thanks, Ruth, and thank you, Anne, for organising and hosting today. I'll start with my introduction. My name is Hannah Gould. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a white woman with brown hair wearing a black button-up shirt. I speak with an Australian accent, and I'm ARC Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. I call you today from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In April, photographs of mass death and mass disposal circulated around the globe. Hundreds of pine coffins being buried on Hart Island, trench graves in Brazil and Iran, military vehicles collecting the dead at night in Italy, and emergency morgue trucks lining the streets of New York. The photos communicated the full, devastating impact of the pandemic, one that had perhaps exceeded the capacity of the modern death care system to cope with bodies, and in many ways of our capacity to recognise the dead as individual persons. Mass or communal death is not a neutral mode of disposition. Mass interment, whether it be of whole bodies or of cremated remains, often marks an aberrant or bad death. It occurs where the dead body is considered dangerous, whether or not it's the case, where our practical and emotional capacities to care are overwhelmed, or where persons are not recognised as part of the moral community to begin with. But as well as studying how death care has responded to COVID-19 in Australia, I also work in Japan, and this idea of mass death got me thinking about the mixed meanings of communal death and interment. In the aftermath of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, a shortage of kerosene led authorities to bury almost 20,000 people in mass graves. For a country where over 99.9% of people are cremated, their whole bones lovingly preserved, placed into individual urns, and then interred in ancestral family tombs, the practice was a complete affront to ideas of a good death. However, in contemporary Japan, the communal interment of remains is also used to patch fragmented social networks and indeed to ensure the ongoing care for the dead. Bone Buddhas, or kotsubutsu, which you see behind me, are monumental statues made from many thousand sets of cremated remains that are mixed together with plaster and resin and then moulded into the form of Amida, the Buddha of infinite light. Ishinji Temple in Osaka first began constructing bone Buddhas in the 19th century, gathering together the dispossessed remains of soldiers and disaster victims. Today, their 14 bone Buddhas contain the ashes of approximately 200,000 persons each, whose families have chosen this method of disposition for its convenience, cost, and merit. At a temple in Nagoya, bone Buddhas are being constructed from generations of the local community. The head parishioner, Tanaka-san, decided to build the Buddhas in response to an increasing number of people dying without descendants to care for the grave. This situation is brought about by the demographic disaster of 21st century Japan, its failure quite literally to reproduce the nation, to have children, such that there are no young people now to tend to the posthumous welfare of the dead. Enshrined in bone Buddhas, however, the dead of Tanaka's community can hope to receive regular sutra recitations from priests, fruit and incense from visitors, and gossip from their neighbours, whether or not they're related to the living. It is a practice of concern that relies on newly strengthened horizontal ties within the community and commercial ties to the temple, as opposed to vertical filial ties. The process of making the Buddhas is a messy one. Bone fragments, which are usually preserved, have to be ground down by hand into a fine ash. And this ash is difficult to grasp and contain. Tanaka-san, the head parishioner, always assists in pouring the ashes. He is now well into his 90s and exceedingly tall and frail. He laughs and jokes to me that he has lived so long now because the Buddhas are looking after him from the inside out. That is, he has now inhaled so much of the ash in the process of filling the statues that many of his community now reside inside his lungs. I think here of Sokushinbutsu, the Buddhist process of self-mummification, of turning oneself into a Buddha as he is slowly making one. Bone Buddhas, along with automated columbaria, communal burial societies, and other new technologies, are what I call creative necromaterial practices that are used to remake a fragmented model of death, quite literally and physically. By mixing the individual into the remains of their community and distributing the burdens of care among the living, the bone Buddhas show how communal interment might offer necromaterial solidity or communal solidarity. So in response to these two very different examples then, my questions for the panel and for our discussion are kind of under what conditions can the necrosociality of communal disposal, can communal death be a constructive form of disposition? and then how the bodies of the dead themselves being transformed or remade to generate these new kinds of relations. Thank you.
Sally?
Hi everyone, my name is Sally Rowden. I use she, hers pronouns. I'm a white woman with blonde hair worn up tonight. I have a black headset on and glasses. I speak with a New Zealand accent. Behind me is a background of Hart Island in New York City that I'll be talking about. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. On April 9, 2020, activist and artist Melinda Hunt released drone footage of COVID casualties being buried in trenches by prisoners on Hart Island. It vividly communicated the scale of the tragedy. These images became a synecdoche of authorities' struggle to deal with overwhelming mortality, of people's longing for contact with dying relatives, and of America's failure to handle the pandemic. These images shocked New Yorkers, who are mostly unaware of Hart Island, though its cemetery operations are largely unchanged over 150 years. Amid the confusion that April day, false rumours began circulating that unclaimed COVID dead would be buried temporarily in city parks. Mayor Bill de Blasio struggled to control what the images signified. The pictures of our fellow New Yorkers being buried on Hart Island are devastating for all of us. Remember, these are human beings. These are neighbours we've lost. There will be no mass burials on Hart Island. Everything will be individual and every body will be treated with dignity. But most New Yorkers weren't buying it. In Europe from the late 18th century, mass graves became a common punishment for poverty. Cross-culturally and historically, societies typically grant appropriate death rights to those they deem members. Withholding these rights then, symbolically and literally, reflects exclusion from the political or moral economy and community, as the histories of war graves and anatomy burials illustrates. The most symbolically potent are those inauspicious dead who've not received proper ritual and burial. An anonymous and unmarked burial in a trench that can rarely be visited then stands as a moral rebuke to New York funeral norms. Here there is no body preparation or display, no ritual, and the disposal place is not named, individually memorialized, or easily accessed by the bereaved. Further, all the labor is performed by inmates from nearby Rikers Island, a prison with a fearsome reputation. Many critics saw the use of inmates to bury the dead as the disenfranchised disposing of the forgotten, marking this labor with a troubling banality of erasure and exploitation. Coincidentally, this is the final image of inmates working on Hart Island. The next day, after 150 years, the city finally employed landscape contractors to handle the burials. There were various policy rationales. Most urgently, COVID had turned Rikers into a death trap, killing both inmates and guards, and there weren't enough people to do the work. Further, as more than one public official sighed to me, the optics were terrible. What had the inmates made of this work? They complained about the lack of protective gear even before COVID, and those I met wanted rituals for the deceased. They thought it was possible for this work to be dignified and did not think it improper for inmates to perform. At its simplest, burying people on Hart Island was respite and solace from prison. I spoke with Saxon Palmer, who worked on Hart Island during my fieldwork in late 2019. Most people who came out to work on the island left after a day or two. I stayed. I looked forward to it every day. It was meaningful. Worth enduring whatever pain and discomfort came with the burials. I was free while I was incarcerated. But my experience with the bodies, both adults and infants, it was a joke. I mean, sometimes the bodies were tossed like footballs. Things would fall open. It felt like we were throwing bags into the earth. It didn't feel like we were burying human beings. There was no decorum, no respect for what we were doing. Daily, I'd say prayers over the bodies as they were going into the pit. The pits looked like what I've seen from Dachau and Auschwitz. It stays with you, all of it. Bob Trabuzio served there in the early 2000s. He said going from Rikers to Hart Island was like Jekyll and Hyde. Tranquility beyond belief, how beautiful it is. And there's people buried there who might have heard Lincoln in person. Oh, definitely. Each one to me was a different individual. To some of the other clowns, they made fun of it. A lot of disrespect. And these babies were very sad. It was like this person never had a chance. But it helped ease the prison time I had to do. Yeah, it made it much easier. I couldn't wait to go to the island. Now, activists like Melinda Hunt argue that without penal labour, a Hart Island burial carries stigma no longer. Some relatives agree with her. And yet Hart Island will sit uneasily as a collective, anonymous municipal burial ground in a society which valorises individualism, responsibilisation, choice and private enterprise. From their own subjugation, the inmates strove to perform care, recognise the dead as individuals with symbolic value, and sought to provide ceremony, as well as drawing meaning and consolation from the labour and the environment. Questions of stigma, dignity and social ties may not be so simple. And my provocation to the panel and to the group is that because of COVID, many families are now experiencing a funeral like those buried at Hart Island. That is, no ritual or memorialisation in the immediate experience of the funeral. How can the stigma and indignity of unrecognised dead be handled more democratically, whether by policy making, civic or media attention, or activist engagement? Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Tamara.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tammy. I use she, her, hers. I'm a white woman with short silver hair, wearing glasses and large silver earrings. There's a full bookcase behind me. I have an American accent. I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne. One hallmark of a good death, being present, has been deeply challenged in this time of COVID that's associated with lonely deaths, restricted funerals, absence of touch, mass graves. Death care in this global crisis is generally framed around the management of loss, not just the loss of life, but the loss of ritual processes as we've known them. At the same time, the gap left by loss often invites creativity. I want to offer a provocation questioning how individual lived conditions shape the form and value of presence around death. I'm speaking to you through Zoom from my home in Melbourne, where I sit on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. 6 weeks ago, from this very same seat, I attended a Zoom funeral for Robert Cook Sr., led by a Jehovah's Witness elder in North Carolina and attended by several hundred of Robert's friends and extensive family. I was invited by his son, Cush, who joined the Zoom event from a supermax prison in Pennsylvania. The service ended with a beautiful poem composed by Cush, and I was moved to happy tears by the thought of Cush being there, not only as a witness co-present through the screen, but also projected out of the walls of the prison and into that free community through his loving poetic tribute to his father. Pre-COVID, this would not have been possible. Cush spent 29 out of the past 32 years in solitary confinement on death row. He's never had a mobile phone, nor used a computer, nor seen a social media site. He writes letters, reads voraciously, and produces art and poetry. This year, when the COVID-19 virus spread quickly through the prison, all visitation was shut down. In its place, prison officials arranged all social contact through booked and monitored Zoom visits, which is how it was possible for Cush to attend the funeral for his father, who had survived a bout of COVID only to perish a few months later. Creative application of technologies, Zoom in this case, can work to enable or restage anyone's presence. But the moral weight of that presence can only be understood in light of very different life trajectories. Here in Australia, the press has tended to represent COVID death through the lens of a free, privileged, and networked world. When Melbourne locked down, the strict limit on funeral attendance was viewed as the ultimate deprivation, the yardstick against which all attempts to loosen restrictions in other practice was measured. Webcast funerals, rarely mentioned, were seen as gimmicks. Hardly a gimmick to Cush, of course, as technology offered him the opportunity to be present against all the odds. But we must also realize that if technologies perform miracles of presence, they can also facilitate absence. Imagine one of Robert's grandchildren there for the funeral, but also elsewhere through their smartphones, present to their friends through social media, but virtually absent to the congregation. Which raises the question, what does it mean to be present around death in our variously technologically mediated worlds? Perhaps it's less about being in a place and time and more about the quality of a relational presence and the potential through any media to offer care. We see this kind of engaged yet mediated presence in so much of what is happening now to manage care for the dead from a safe distance. Jewish Kadisha members on their respective Zoom screens engaging in an imaginary gentle washing of the dead body from a distance. Memorials with limited gatherings timetabled over Google Docs. The sending of Uber Eats to people as mourning gifts. The use of robots like Pepper, a semi-humanoid Buddhist priest conducting funerals in Japan, or Carl, a mobile telepresencing bot in the United States. Being present for the deaths of others in troubling times is about so much more than physically being in a designated true location. It's about being engaged in relations of care and responsibility in a Levinasian sense, about looking into the face of the other, even if that encounter is mediated through necrotechnologies. The story about Cush and the Zoom funeral also offers a simple reminder that what is felt as lost by some may not be for all. So my key questions are, how does video conference enabled presence weigh up against physical presence in supporting a good death? How do individual lived conditions shape the form and value of presence around death? And what is required to fully be there with others at a funeral? Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. So I'm the last of our presenters. My name is Ann Allison. I use she, her, hers. I'm a white woman with gray hair, with red glasses, a blue and white shirt. I speak from the ancestral territories of the Haliwa-Saponi, the Tuscarora, the Soyan, and the Katamba, and I'm professor of anthropology at Duke University. So I'd like to start with actually two quotes. The first is from Thomas Lucour, his book, The Work of the Dead, A Cultural History of Mortal Remains, which came out in 2015. We address bones. We live with the dead. Conversely, the willful disposal of the dead is an act of extreme violence. To treat a dead body as if it were ordinary organic matter, or willfully to desecrate and mutilate it, is to erase it from culture and from the human community, to deny the existence of the community from which it came, to deny its humanity. The second quote is from Hans Ruin, who's a philosopher and a phenomenologist. His book is called Being with the Dead: Ancestral Politics and the Roots of Historical Consciousness, came out in 2019. Burial involves the corporeal remains of kin. Yet from their very inception, these remains are not just themselves. They become symbols and ciphers for what they are not. Death, the other, is not there, yet exists as having been. The placelessness of the dead is crucial. Mortuary rituals will always be a care for something in the place of someone who has been, as a shaping and articulation of this being with the dead. This is its temporal and historical reality. So thinking of these two quite profound quotes, I would like to think about organic matter, humanity, and is humanity the same thing as being a part of a community? The ontology of who and what precisely is the dead, and the work and care for taking care of the dead, for, as Hans Ruin says, for something in the place of someone who has been human. Who does this work of care in troubling times? And what becomes of the dead in the absence of such care? Just briefly, I do my work in the context of contemporary Japan, which for a long time has centered kind of identity in terms of the genealogical principle, kinship. Who were you related to? What was your family? What was your patrilineal? Also very patrilineal. And from the time of World War II, this genealogical location of identity has been changed. In the Democratic Constitution of 1948, the grave legally went from being the site for giving respect to the ancestors to now the eternal resting place of and for the individual. So as in the treatment of the grave, the social network has been increasingly individualized. But in the urban migrations that took place right following the Pacific War, people went from the countryside, where their ancestral and familial graves were located, to the city, and increasingly kinship went from something that was extended, multi-generational, increasingly to the nuclear family. In the corporate capitalism and the economic burst growth of the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of concentration on how to be productive within the nuclear unit. Capitalism abounded, consumerism was ripe and rampant. And yet this started to crumble. The bubble economy burst in the early 1990s, and along with other kind of sociological changes, the family started losing its efficacy and its ability to sustain both life and death. So if traditionally, even though there had been this turn to individualization, people would be buried in the ancestral grave with their family, again, patrilineal, increasingly starting in the 80s and the 90s with a turn to flexible economy, a shifting away from lifetime employment, but also demographic changes, a high aging population, low birth rate, a decline in marriage, and a kind of a decline in connectedness. Increasingly, you have what I'm interested in is a turn towards what's called sometimes singleification. Increasingly, people living and dying alone, living in single households. So this is what I've been doing my work on in the context of Japan, is how do people who are finding themselves alone at the end of life, facing the prospect not only of the end of life, but what's going to happen to their bodies, their organic matter, their remains, and what's going to happen to their spirit after death if they don't have another sociological pair of hands to do that work of care for them. And in light of this, and Hannah and I both work in the context of the contemporary moment in Japan, is that there's been a new wave of businesses and enterprises and services, literally called shukatsu, which means ending business, to cater to people who are stranded, who are precarious, who are troubled by the prospect of possibly being all alone, both at the moment of death and post-death. And by the way, the phenomenon that I do a lot of my work on is people who literally die alone and their bodies are discovered after the fact, a phenomenon that's called lonely or solitary death. No one wants to be in the situation, because also if no one then buries your remains, you face the prospect of being a wandering spirit, a hungry ghost, having no place, being placelessness, as Hans Ruhen speaks about it. And so two things that I want to put on the table for possibilities of dealing with the precarity of placelessness upon death. In Shukasu, one of the enterprises that is starting to develop are alternative burial places where you can make arrangements before you die. So a lot of it is to anticipate the possibility that you might be in this stranded situation and take it upon yourself not to rely on a family, which you possibly don't have, or not to rely on anyone else, the existence of which is not there, but to rely on yourself to make arrangements so that you will be tended and cared for post-death. And so increasingly there is this anticipatory sociality, anticipatory care, which nonetheless is taken and tasked to the individual to do for themselves. So one of the questions I have is that social? Is that self-sociality? Is the self taking over what the other once did, but no longer is available to do so? And the other form of social caring for the dead that I've become interested in is in some of these alternative burial associations. People who do not have family members or anyone else to be buried next to can now purchase a plot, a space in a burial place. And if you don't want to be all alone, you can also think about acquiring a grave friend. So this is called hakatomo, having a grave friend. So you have someone who doesn't actually do the work of caregiving you. They don't do the Buddhist. I mean, traditionally, family members were supposed to do sutras and do rituals and tend to your grave for 33 years before you became a Buddha or a god or an ancestor. A grave friend doesn't do that kind of work, doesn't do that kind of caregiving. It's more a lateral accompaniment into death. So a friend is a different kind of social relationship of caregiving. So one of my questions is, does that change the ontological nature of what the dead is? Are you still a form of a community? Or does that change the work of care post-death? So my provocation is, in what can be creative responses to the conditions of dying socially all alone, are new forms of sociality emerging, or new understandings of the meaning ontology of death as something requiring social recognition and care from others itself? Thank you. So now we would like to invite people who are in the audience. If you have questions for us, please put them on question and answering. And we have 25 minutes. And we also thought that we would go individually through the questions that each of us put on the table.
Yeah, so shall we start with Ruth then?
So maybe we should go should we just do the first, should we just go in order? And then I see that there's one question. So Ruth, maybe we should go to the question that you asked and spend a few minutes, and then we'll just go to yeah. And
Yes.
We'll
And I'll read it again for everyone. So my question was, if a response to an epidemic, in this case, transformations in how we mark death, are always simultaneously about something else, what is the something else that we're looking at under COVID? And I must say that to just, I think link together some of our questions, as I was taking a note of the common threads that went through all of our presentations, particularly Hannah's presentation on this idea of mass burial and what it might mean and things. One thing that troubled me in my own question, and I think is a thread through the others, is this issue of, are we really talking about transformations? Are we really talking about things that are new here? Or is it more the case that what we're talking about is shifts in the speed at which things that are already happening were happening? You know, that in some ways, you know, COVID might be new disease, but it's still the same old death, you know? And so I was wondering, you know, that when I was thinking about these transformations, are they really transformations at all? Anyway.
Yeah, so I think having done a lot of work now also in the Australian funeral industry and kind of attending COVID funerals, and I was really struck in your presentation by that idea. And obviously the bone Buddhas in some ways are new technologies, but they've also been around since the 18th century. And Zoom is a new technology, but to some extent these kind of digital funerals or digital presences have also been, we all know, kicking around, very kind of unpopular, but kicking around in the death care industry for a while now. So I'm not sure it is necessarily transformation as much as it could be, you know, an exacerbation of certain tensions or social trends or demographic collapses that already exist. And in other cases, maybe a slight shift. Transformation always sounds to me a little bit too grand to describe perhaps what's going on.
Right. When you were talking, Hannah, about, you know, this this mass death and you know, how do we think about communal mourning? One thing that I remembered is in the context where I work in Singapore, death is very much something that starts off as being about the individual, but by the space of a few generations, that individual has gone. So you start off with your own tablet on the ancestral altar, and then after 3 generations, then your individual tablet is removed and you're considered as part of all the ancestors' tablet. And so we've always had these shifts in death, in this kind of this declining of this shift from the individual to not individual. But somehow that shift is happening at different speeds now. And I think that's something that is interesting here too.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost the difference of like, it's a similar thing in Japan. Obviously, you're memorialized as an individual, and slowly the end goal is you fade into the ancestors. Right. But it's almost like in response to hyper individuality, what Anne describes, the response is to go communal right away, right? You're just going to become part of a Buddha, and we don't know. It's not like you know your mum's in the small toe of the Buddha or the mouth or the smile. You know, you are immediately just the ancestors. And it's really interesting. But what you're saying about, you know, to come full circle back to your question about what else is it about? Maybe it is something to do with that speed or those borders and boundaries we've been talking about. If COVID's not just about the body, and I've heard similar complaints from mortuary workers and embalmers in Australia, you know, the COVID body's not that dangerous. You know, we know how to deal with this. Why are we putting them in body bags? Maybe it's about a reaction to the speed of connections, global connections, reaction to the porous boundaries between people through movement that let these kind of pandemics spread. I thought for the panel.
Can I jump in to that one?
Please do.
Sorry, interestingly, when you posed the question that it's not just about keeping people safe, right? It's that, what is it beyond that? And it makes me think again in the prison context, when it's more also about the different values that are placed on individual bodies. And so in the context of COVID, in prison, there was a lot of coverage in the United States about decarceration to flatten the curve, get people out who are near the end of sentences or whatever, just to try to get rid of that density. And I thought, oh, this is good because I'm all for that, right? But really, it was less about decarceration because of the value of these people who have served their time, and it was more about ideas about a general public, not the danger to the people within the prison. It was about the danger of releasing, this pandemic or affecting publics through that release, and that public conversation revealed a very different kind of reason beyond this notion of keeping people safe. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
And I wonder if that doesn't go to Sally's question. I mean, Sally, exactly. Tammy, I absolutely agree with you. Who is it that gets recognized? Who is it that gets cared for? And who doesn't, both in this moment and in any moment? And in Sally, your question, how can the stigma and dignity of the unrecognized dead be handled more democratically, whether by policymaking, civic or media attention, or activist engagement? That kind of duplicates the question that I'm asking as well, is whose responsibility is it to care for the unrecognized dead? And is it the state? Is it a civic operation? Is it up to the individual? Is it only the people who have money, or which I think is maybe a version of what both Ruth and Tammy and Hannah, all of you are speaking about. But Sally, did you want to say anything else? Or
Yeah, I think in the context of, I'm speaking from the United Kingdom, where it's Armistice Day, and so there is the annual veneration of the unknown soldier, and so that kind of emblematic that we must care for this person, this one person that we don't know, who is all of us because he is one of us, is given such focus for that one day, and yet, when I compare that with the New York situation that I witnessed, there was a lot of rhetoric about how COVID is going to democratize death, that it can reach anyone, that now Hart Island is going to change because anyone can be buried here. And of course, that's not the case. Hart Island has always been racialized, and it's certainly it is a specific type of New Yorker that will end up in Hart Island, so that democracy does not reach into there. And also veterans will never go to Hart Island. So there is absolutely kind of classes of citizenship and equity at work here that just don't get disclosed through these processes.
One thing that I've been thinking about recently, and I don't know, Hannah, if you would agree with me, but in after 3/11, the compound disaster that happened in Japan, and there was, as Hannah mentioned, all of these bodies that were stranded. There was a national response. There was a lot of volunteerism on the parts of many people to somehow do some sort of gesture, either in kind of grieving the dead or going up to Tohoku and actually participating in retrieving body parts or whatever. And yet the people who I've been kind of interested in, the people who die all alone, there's no equivalent kind of response to that, to those people, even though those are also happening nationally. So even when, as we're saying, who gets recognized and who doesn't get recognized, there were a lot of stranded people post 3/11, but it was hailed as a national crisis. And like the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, there's something national, nationalistically that can be inspired around that. But when you die all alone, stranded, that doesn't add up. That doesn't count. It's a different kind of, it has a different kind of political weight to it.
And it's interesting, Hannah and I work as well in new technologies around death within the death industry in the US and Japan and UK. and Australia. And a lot of those innovations are, you know, the designers who are designing for futures don't have everyone in mind, right? There is a and there's a market that caters for a particular common denominator that doesn't include so many people and so many capacities. So it's really interesting, because from that perspective, you don't get this nuanced discussion about yeah, difference and equality and bodies.
It goes back to this huge whole romantic myth, right, of, you know, Daniel Defoe writing about the bubonic plague pits and medieval Europe, right, the great grave of humankind. You know, everyone was stripped of their clothes and tossed in together, women and men, and you know, death is the great equalizer, which is, you know, not to add a level of Australian swearing, but it's shit, you know. It's a complete bullshit. There's no, it doesn't exist, as all these examples show. I wonder, as we have 10 minutes, Anne, we've just been told if there's any questions that panelists might like to address specifically that are in the Q&A or in the chat. Not if anyone has further contributions as well.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a question here to Tammy. Can you talk more about, you know, the incredibly interesting case about Kush? And then question to Sally. Yeah, how about if we just read them, and then the 10 minutes that we probably can spend 10 minutes answering. Sally, I'm interested in how you did the research on the island. Was a part of a larger project on burial there from past to present? Did prisoners make a political critique of Trump or other leaders? And from Casey, questions for a number of us. For Ruth, I'm struck by the invocation of AIDS, as an AIDS body would not look like a body succumbed to SARS. And to Hannah, I'm struck by the comment that mass interment is aberrant. It can be sacrificial in many instances. For everyone, I wonder what bringing notions of sacrifice to the table can explain what we mean by troubling times. So go ahead, Tammy.
Yeah, just very briefly, it's a long story, so I'll just say a little bit. I've for a long time been communicating through letters, so I have an epistolary relationship with a number of different men, African-American men on death row or solitary, who for several decades, and I'm very interested in how they make themselves in that context, as well as how they make themselves into people who can often be executed by the state or could be executed by the state. And that has kind of brought me into the study of death, I suppose. And I'm less interested in the crimes that were or were not committed, and more into a sort of humanistic understanding of how people make themselves through what they do in their lives. And so this interest in Kush was, came out of this 6-year, very, excellent relationship that we have through our letters. And I was invited to that Zoom, and it allowed me to contemplate as a visitor to the funeral, which I've never done. I've looked a lot at Zoom and what it does in funerals from the industry perspective, but here I was in the audience, and it made me think about it at a different level. Thank you.
I'll jump in and address the question about my research. So this is my doctoral fieldwork. I've been out of the field for 3 weeks. And so, yes, it was part of a larger project. I was looking at how citizenship of New York City survives death and what happens to New Yorkers who can't afford a funeral. So I was already looking at this when it happened. I have visited Hart Island 5 times, including the last visit before the island was shut due to COVID. And the prisoners had no political opinions that they shared with me, but their one kind of thought related to COVID is, wow, they've really cleaned up the processes and they've found some protective gear.
Ruth, you want to talk about the AIDS body?
Yes, I will. So I too was, hi Casey, I was struck by this invocation of the AIDS body, as you say, that an AIDS body and a COVID body could not be more different. very much in the state discourse, the AIDS body is imagined as this incredibly dangerous body that provides a threat to the whole society. You see still in Singaporean television, which is shaped very heavily by government policy, shows. I remember watching one soap opera which was about a family with a father who had AIDS, HIV from his immoral relationship with a prostitute, who other families were afraid to go in the swimming pool. So still there is this level in the media, in state policy, presentation of AIDS as this great threat. And the fact that it was then put onto COVID, I thought was very, very interesting and peculiar, as you know. Yeah.
Does anyone want to address the question about sacrifice? I mean, that's kind of huge. Or Casey, if you can comment, if you can say something, you articulated it so well. If you would like to speak up in the 3 minutes that we have. And by the way, I don't think that I don't think the virtual hallway is operating. Is that right, Elaine? I don't think that we have the option to continue this conversation, unfortunately.
That is correct.
Yes, thank you.
Maybe I'll just say about sacrifice, if Casey can not get on, is that I think it very much links to what we're talking about in situations of great pandemic or kind of these romantic national stories of war, that those are the bodies then of the dead that become the unknown soldier, representative of the entire population. I think even, how the British discourse of the NHS frontline health workers, right? It's very, war language of battling COVID on the front lines, NHS. And similarly, the way that the UK government has decided to memorialise those dead through these kind of national websites and days of mourning and very, unknown soldier-esque kind of situation. I think in that case, communal death becomes the individual stands for the whole. Whereas in other situations like Japan or otherwhere, it's less about that kind of relationship and more about attempting to become part of the whole or to grasp onto that sense of communal belonging, because you don't have it, because it's been taken away from you. And they're not less recognized, I think. In a way, the people who enter the Buddha are not individuals who sacrifice, they're just the communal. They don't have the chance to stand for the society.
I mean, the thing that's also interesting is, the anti-sacrifice. I mean, to go back to what both Tom LaCour and Hans, Ruhl and so many other people have said, is that how you honor the dead is you somehow connect them, what you said, Hannah, to a community, some notion of a whole. But for those people who don't have that whole, then you don't stand in as the unknown soldier. You stand for nothing. You're not able to be sacrificed. I mean, isn't this Gomben's whole point, is that you just die, but you don't have the ability to be sacrificed, and your death doesn't stand for anything, which means that you're also not accorded that kind of humanism of having some sort of recognition post-death. So one of my questions would be, is there another way to think about that? Is that the only model for showing, grievability or humanization to the dead who otherwise don't have another social to be stitched to? I mean, it's kind of a sacrifice question, but it's kind of coming at it from the other way.
You can also see sacrifice, as Hannah was suggesting, in terms of the frontline workers. It's also the discourse around the limitations placed on the grieving community are couched in a language of sacrifice as well, and which implies a sacrifice in that context also implies that once the emergency is over, you can go back to something else. And I'm wondering if that is always really what we're talking about here. I'm wondering if some of these shifts are moving us forward in a different direction. And Anne is, of course, asking a big question about that in terms of different ontologies of death itself.
Maybe that's a good place to
More questions than answers.
So thank you all. thank you for all the participants who came. Thank you for our interpreters. Thank you, Elaine. And for the panelists, it looks like Hannah has sent us a Zoom so we can catch up in a minute. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.